And so that's basically my pathway to story, if you like, and storytelling. But I find that so often in English language teaching, when we talk about story and we talk about storytelling, it tends to connect with slightly niche representations like young learners, storytelling for young learners, or folk tales, stories from long ago and far away. And so I'm kind of sometimes find myself trying to tell people that no, it's not about folk tales for me, although that there's no problem with folk tales. And I'm not a teacher of young learners. I teach teenagers and I teach adults. But for me, story is for everything, everybody. You know, so can I ask you a question? And please answer this in the chat. Do you consider yourself to be a storyteller in the classroom? Do you consider yourself to be a storyteller in the classroom? You could say yes. You could say no. You could say maybe, if you don't want to commit to it. You could say sometimes, as Derek's just said, and John, and user. I mean, it would be difficult to be a storyteller in a class, like always. I could say to you, for example, are you a swimmer? And very few people would say sometimes, would they? Even if you were an Olympic swimmer, you would still say, yes, I'm a swimmer. It doesn't mean you're always swimming. So yes, sometimes is an interesting answer, isn't it? I like Lucy's answer, definitely. And Amy says amusing anecdotes, and Barry, absolutely. And Claire's becoming more of a storyteller. Now, nobody's said no. Which is interesting. There's usually quite a lot of no's. So let me ask you a question then. Second question. For those of you who are sometimes or yes or anecdotes, can you think of a personal anecdote that you have shared with your students in the last few months, and that it maybe wasn't planned, or maybe it was, maybe it was improvised, maybe it was a topic that just came up, you shared a story and you thought, that kind of worked. At least it created some, when I say it worked, I mean it created some sort of good feeling or rapport or energy in your students. You immersed them in English. This is what I mean when I say it worked. Now, what I'd like you to do is try and recall that story and type it into the chat, or rather a one-line summary into the chat. Let me give you a few examples of my own. I'm going to give you some one-line summaries of a number of stories that I've shared with my own students in the last few years. Number one is the story of a broken elbow and a broken heart. A very sad story. This is actually my scar story. Can you see that there? The scar in my arm. It's an epic story. The story of a broken elbow and a broken heart. What about the time that I thought my Barcelona postman was trying to sell me drugs? A story I once shared. I may have shared this in Seville once, but I can't recall whether or not it was ACEIA. Good story, that one. What about the tragic story of 7-year-old Jenny's pet grass snake? You see, so I'm not actually telling you the stories, but I'm definitely giving you a kind of flavor for them, giving you some kind of narrative, or at least seeding some kind of narrative that you're creating in your mind. This is the kind of function of a one-line story, if you call it. What about the time I got bitten by a vicious little dog on the way to work, and upon complaining to the owner, was accused of being a liar? These are all true things that happened to me. This was when I say on the way to work, it was actually on the way to teaching, probably about 10 years ago. The story of my driving instructor, whose name was Mr. Glasgow, who lived in Edinburgh, and his obsession with hedgehogs. The story of a teacher friend of mine who was paid in cash, and she used to think that her freezer, or at least the freezer compartment within her fridge, was a good place for her to store the money. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. How about a story of kleptomania? A story of kleptomania, the time when I lost my skipping rope during lockdown. That's a recent addition, as you can probably guess. A misunderstanding that I had with my own mother as a result of a Scottish homophone. That's a word that looks different, two words that look different, spelt different, but sound the same. How about a story about a mini success I had when I was learning French at school many, many years ago, which turned out to be a total social failure in disguise. And one of my favorites, the time when I unexpectedly impressed a girl when I threw a pineapple at a taxi. And I have to point out that that one happened when I was 15 years old. It wasn't recent. It taught me a lot about women and how to impress them. So can you share yours? I want you to share your stories here. Just try to think of a story that you recall, and turn it into a one-line story and share it in the chat. And my eyes are on the chat. So we've got Olga, paranormal story, the time when I heard a knock on the door during a class later in the evening and there was just darkness. Now you see, this is great because Olga hasn't told us the whole story, but she's got her appetite for it and she's given us some kind of narrative in her own minds that we're constructing, maybe predicting. When we thought that your brother had been taken away by a tidal wave, wow, that's quite a story, Mick. That sounds like quite a remarkable story. The story of how your half-brother's father turned out to be your gardener. Great, Kate. That sounds like a coincidence story. The haunting story of your mother, your sister, and a ghost called the Man. Wow, so a ghost story. I hope you're going to tell that to your students at Halloween, Lucy. One of your favorites is the real story of your sister projecting her young daughters by protecting her young stories, her young daughters by killing a spitting cobra. Wow, that's a story of motherly protection. Fantastic. Two English guys found a crate of wine. The police found them and locked them up for the night. Wow. Barry, were you one of those English guys? An embarrassing moment in a new Zoom class with council workers and dirty pop-ups. Fantastic. I wondered if you've got the video there, Amy. No, I'm not going to. The biggest earthquake you've ever experienced, Derek. That's a very interesting one. There's stories which are kind of related to communities sometimes. And you know, you might have, if you live in Finland, you might have your moose story. If you live in, everybody right now has got their lockdown story. Maybe if you're gay, you've got your coming out story. So stories which are about community. I had an earthquake story of my own and made a fool of myself by telling it to a group of Mexicans who thought, So it often depends on your, I wasn't impressing them. The time you went to Las Vegas, drove through desert and got in a helicopter for 12, I would love to hear these stories. Got stuck on a zip line in the Amazon. The time you flew a small plane for 2 minutes. Now, what you've just shared is absolute gold. I don't know if you've realized this, but what you've just shared is possibly the most valuable teaching resource, bar none. More valuable than any video, any image, any course book. That is a story. Every single one of these stories you've posted, I would love to hear. I would love to have a coffee with you all right now and to hear your stories. And if I was your students, that would certainly be the case. And we're not saying that these stories have to be long and, you know, we're not talking about teacher talking for 90 minutes. My favorite stories are ones which are short and snappy. But one thing I really press you or encourage you to do is to collect them. So do you all have note apps? For example, it could be Evernote, the elephant one at the top row there, or it could be maybe Apple Notes, or I'm sure there's an Android version. One of my favorites is in the second row. It's a bear, and unfortunately it's only for iPhones and Apples. But it's a great note app and it allows you to take notes. And what I do here is I collect my stories. And every time I recall a story, it could come up in conversation. It could come up in response to something you're thinking about. You might be watching something on Netflix, but when it comes to you, you go, oh, that's a good story. Take a note of it. This is what writers do. This is what novelists do. This is what stand-up comedians do. And this is what teachers should do as well.